Does South Africa have minorities that require special protection beyond what is provided for in the Bill of Rights? Even though an internationally accepted definition of the term remains contentious, Article 1 of the United Nations Minorities Declaration says that minorities are based on national or ethnic, cultural, religious, and other linguistic identities, and it provides that states should protect their existence. Welcome to another edition of Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for being with us. Really do appreciate it. In tonight's episode, we ask the question, has South Africa safeguarded against the rights of minorities in the past 30 years? And who qualifies as a minority in the South African context? To discuss this matter, we're joined in studio by Zolile Burns-Ngamashe, who is the Deputy Minister of the Department of Cooperative Governance with a focus on traditional affairs. We also have in studio with us leader of the Garakgokwa tribe, that is Neville Felix, and we are joined virtually by Ernst Roots, the head of policy at the Solidarity Movement. But before we start our conversation, let's have a look at what some of you have had to say.
Te wa qobetse ka de e gangce ke te twe ko ya hek e ta ha platform tenti kwana te o dam he gwi qobe dam khona gwi kwa ga za ma hambe nge o khona za ma wo qobe ngke ga
Onze gemeenskap nee ek dink by myne die meeste van ons het die werkgeleentheid nie want die mense kom met leerbeloftes veral die politieke, hulle kom leeg, hulle kom met leerbeloftes en ons huise word gebou, maar dit word nie gebou word nie. Hulle kom leeg, hulle kom skryf net die mense, sê details en leeg hulle van hulle sal die huise kom bou.
Met ka 30 years democracy, ka kwan government ki kuluju. Ti ka khalente ti de juka last ti.
And those were the views of South Africans on the ground reflecting on minority rights in the 30 years of our democracy. We begin the conversation with the Deputy Minister. I want to ask you quite pointedly, does South Africa have minorities, given that we have a constitution that wants to embrace all that live within it? There's a conversation about whether there's a need to identify us all uniquely and separately. So the question is, does South Africa have minorities?
Well, we would say we do have communities with a very significantly minimum population. Some with a very specific cultural and ethnic identity, who, by virtue of the population, classify themselves as falling within that category of definition. So we acknowledge that there will be those kind of situations.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Felix, you're a part of the Garakgokwa tribe. You lead the Garakgokwa tribe. But you specifically don't want to speak about minority rights. You think we should speak about specifically indigenous rights. Tell me why.
Well, firstly, we ourselves have never classified ourselves as a minority group in this country. Because we are a sovereign people. We are a sovereign people with a specific history that has been recorded over the last 372 years. In other words, we were here before governance even started in South Africa. And what we are saying is that we are not a minority group in the sense of being posted somewhere. We are the foundation of South Africa. In fact, history even substantiates that we're the mothers and the fathers of all tribal factions and stuff that had happened on the South, because our people had assimilated with numerous peoples over different epochs of time. So the question that is on the table, why is there still the ethnic stereotyping and segregation policies that is still in place within a democracy? For me, those two questions are diabolically opposed to each other. And this is the argument that we're having. In South Africa, in its confusion, in all due respect, we don't operate like other countries, international countries. We don't say, I'm a this, I'm a that. first thing we say, oh, I'm a South African, but I'm with the old label that somebody gave me when they stole my identity. Okay? I'm not colored. I'm colorful, but I'm not colored. Okay? So the question that is at the heartbeat of this nation is that we're coming from a very specific point of view to embrace. We've chased nobody away.
How do you want to be identified?
We want to be identified according to who we are. When Van Riebeeck came here in his 3 diaries, when he asked us who were we said to him, we're the Sonkais. And the meaning of the word Sonkais means supreme beings. So here you have people with a skewed European strategy that had come to plunder and rape and do whatever they did in the land, ecocide, genocide, and so forth, with a specific process. That's why they brought military and everything along with them. And we were people that welcomed everybody here. We weren't a funny group of people. There's only 2 groups of people that you found here originally. And that's the Kwe Kam people, which means the Kwe and the San. Those are the foundation groups of South Africa's population. In fact, if you go to the historical...
But I mean, and not to belabor the point too much, right? What you even consider South African from a geographical border perspective has changed vastly over time compared to then, right? If we think about it, the Masarwa people of what is now Namibia, what is now Botswana, also have a claim to the soil of what is South Africa. If you think about the Kalangas of what is still now Botswana and Namibia,
correct,
they also have that claim. What do you then say, answer the question about who are the natives and the indigenous of South Africa?
Well, it's very simple. It's not a complex situation. Before 1884, with the scramble to cut up South Africa, not just South Africa,
Southern
but Africa,
yeah,
as a whole, at the one-year conference, it's called the Berlin Conference, it was used as a litmus process to try and prevent the consistent wars that was happening in Europe, because they were fighting everybody. Whenever there's a war, just go to Europe, you will find all the culprits there. In fact, the Germans fought everybody. So we need to understand what also then happened to the Germanic peoples and how they divided up Europe into smaller pockets. And part of those problems started to emanate. That is why you find the assassination of the person that they put in place, the whole concept idea of what we're discussing today. He was, Bismarck was his surname, and he was assassinated by a European assassin.
Okay.
So the point I'm making to you is that they've brought in another cultural aspect and concept which is un-African, which they've introduced into our area of jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And by doing so, they've also stole our lineage, our heritage, our identity, and everything else. But the time has come for us to start talking to one another.
Yeah. Ernst, I want to bring you into the conversation. You're a white Afrikaans man living in South Africa in 2024. Are you a minority?
Well, yes, we certainly are a minority. I think you can think about South Africa in a certain sense as a community of communities, in the sense that it is a very diverse country with a variety of different cultures, languages, ethnicities, and so forth. And there's a reason why why democracy is called democracy, and why it's not just called majoritarianism, because majoritarianism in essence means that whoever wins the election can do whatever they want. And that's not what a democracy is, or at least that's not what a democracy is supposed to be. A democracy is supposed to be a system in which people have equal rights. In other words, people can vote and so forth.
Sure.
But it's more than that. It's also a system with rule of law, with accountable government, and with minority rights. And that's why we always say that the test as to whether a democracy is a well-functioning democracy or a healthy democracy is not just whether people can vote, but also whether minority communities who are not necessarily represented in government also feel included and respected.
So what makes you a minority?
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, there's some debate. There still is some debate as to what is the definition of a minority, and so we can debate that. But the essence of it is that we are a unique people. The Afrikaans word is volk. You might say nation, although there's also talk of the South African nation. But South Africa is in a sense a nation or a bigger territory consisting of a variety of nations. And the Afrikaner people, at least, are unique in the sense that we have a unique history, we have a unique culture, we have
everybody has a unique history and a unique culture. Are we all minorities?
Well, I think that's the point I made right at the beginning, that South Africa is a community of different communities. I'm not saying that Afrikaners are unique in the sense that we're the only ones that has a unique culture or a unique language, but that this culture and this language makes us unique, and it's something worth fighting for, and it's something worth preserving. And in as far as we experience that we are pressured to dissolve into something else, we regard that as a threat to our sustained identity.
Okay, what rights do you want that a minority should be bestowed with that specifically would protect you from dissolving into something else?
Well, the question as to whether a minority is respected and protected can be measured in a variety of ways. The easiest is just simply, does this minority community feel included and respected? But other than that, the question is whether they are included and respected in terms of legislative processes and laws, which we certainly are aggressively being excluded through racially discriminatory laws and policies. But other than that, also with the way we are treated by government officials and employees, where in South Africa, we know the situation with hate speech in South Africa and derogatory comments made especially towards white people, but also made towards Afrikaners. So for us to be included as a community, for a start, we would need the hate speech to stop. We would need the derogatory commentary and the scapegoating to stop. But also we would need the exclusionary laws and policies to stop. Yeah,
I'm going to pause it there. Minister, I'm going to come back and talk about exactly that. Aaron says there are laws and policies that exclude white Afrikaners, that makes them a minority. We'll talk about that in context, of course, of the history of our country. We'll continue the conversation on the other side of this. Don't go away. Welcome back to this edition of Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for being with us. If you're just joining us, you're missing out on a very deep and heated conversation detailed on South Africa's history and minority rights in particular. The question is, does South Africa give sufficient protection to minorities? Before we went to the break, Deputy Minister, Adam Roots of the Solidarity Movement made the argument that there's specific uniquities of the Afrikaner folk that makes them who they are, and therefore they're a minority. And what has been happening democratically is that there are certain policies and laws that have excluded them. The treatment by government officials, he says, is a form of discrimination. They are hate speech garnered towards or expressed towards Afrikaner people. Given the context of South Africa, do you agree with that?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that colonialism and apartheid are part of the reality of our past. And we must acknowledge the fact that when European nations assaulted the African continent, dispossessed of its people, assets like land and so on. It is the reality that we must first acknowledge, that it's what happened. And it was not a right thing to happen. That's why our Constitution, in its preamble, it talks about redressing the injustices of the past. Because we must acknowledge that this is what happened. This is what we did. And it then becomes a very fair conversation to say, acknowledging that this is what happened, how do we then deal with the redress? How do we deal with the future? Having addressed the past, And we had that opportunity as South Africans to define the kind of future South Africa we want. And it emanated into a constitution, a final constitution. That constitution is very prescriptive in terms of the rights that must be observed, that must be enjoyed by all citizens. And if you look in terms of section 235 of the Constitution, it guarantees self-determination to groups with a common heritage and culture. So that, what I'm trying to say is that the Constitution has so generously endeavored to reach out to all people of South Africa in their different cultural, linguistic, and so on. So in that context, we would say, at least with the Constitution, we have a guarantee, because that's the supreme law of the land. And as various instruments of government, different departments, we have different pieces of legislation that seek to give expression to those critical injunctions put across in the Constitution. And it's work in progress. Yeah. And I'm sure in these 30 years, we have tried a lot to make sure that at the level of policy and legislation, there is a lot that has been done to decolonize and also de-racialize some of the instruments and institutions that were there.
Yeah. Do you believe that our laws are racialized to the exclusion of minorities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because there's quota systems. We are not all equal South Africans because of some of the legislation that has been enacted. If you go and do a due diligence in most of the companies and the people that is facilitating work in South Africa, you will find that the majority of the indigenous and so-called colored groupings are at the bottom of the rank, in the social rank in South Africa. And it's not something that we're afraid to mention, but it's obviously there. You have an unstructured state that initiated this program since 1652. It went into 1936, and a whole range of other issues have happened. But I heard you make mention of the Constitution. And is the Constitution sufficient? And my argument with the Constitution is that it has limitations in addressing the very preamble that was mentioned by the Deputy
What are
Minister.
those limitations?
The limitations is, as far as the land question goes, we only go back to the Native Land Act.
1913.
Absolutely. We don't go beyond 1910 with anything. Because you see, if we go beyond that, after the Anglo-Boer War in 1902 and the signing of the peace treaty, which was a proxy war between European descendants here and other European descendants. But they didn't think, though we were part of that war, we were not.
How far back should we go?
We should go back to the foundation. We should go back to 1652.
Okay. Ernst, do you acknowledge, as the minister argues, that redress is a necessary in South Africa, given 300 years of pillage, of economic exclusion of natives in South Africa, 300 years of disenfranchisement? Do you acknowledge today that redress is necessary? Oh, Ernst, I think you muted yourself there. Do you mind just unmuting yourself first so we can hear you?
Apologies for that. Let me first say that I think if the question is it accurate to say that we just had 350 years of pillaging and exploitation, I think that's a gross simplification. I think history is much more complex than that. There's also many examples of cooperation, of working together and helping each other, and I think we should consider that as well. But if the question is whether certain measures should be put in place to address some atrocities that happened in the past, obviously. But this is not what is currently happening in South Africa, and it is not what has been happening for the last 30 years. it doesn't seem to me or to us that the ruling party or the government understands that there's a difference between restitution and redistribution. They seem to be fixated on racial redistribution while forgetting what restitution actually means. So
restitution means to restore to its original position. If we were to restore to its original position, it means nobody of a settler heritage would be a landowner in South Africa effectively. Is that what you're asking for?
No, that's a very grotesque comment to make. That would mean, if that's the case, but what you are effectively saying is that a black person does not have the capacity to sell property. So if a black person sells property and the purchaser is white, then surely we must at least on some level acknowledge that there is a way for a white person that owns land or that owns property to be the legitimate owner of that property, and that person's right has to be respected. If we claim that restitution simply means black people must own everything, that's an insult to black people, because it's to say that black people do not have the capacity to act in a modern economy where they can sell.
Adams, just very briefly, I do have to take a break. If we are to restore, how far back, and I asked the same question to Neville Felix just now, how far back should we restore to?
Well, I think the question for us is not first and foremost how far back should we go, but the question is first and foremost what actually happened on a particular piece of land. How was it acquired by the people who own it? Did they buy that land, or did they take that land through illegitimate means? If they took it through illegitimate means, it must be given back. But the history of land ownership is much more complex than simply giving and handing out to people.
Yeah, we're going to have to just pause it there and take a quick break. On the other side of this, we wrap up the conversation. Welcome back to Democracy 30. If you just joined us, you've missed a heated conversation. We're in the final segment of our program this evening. I want to perhaps take the conversation from here. As a native, as an indigenous, we can say minority for semantic purposes. For you to be a fully recognized human of this land, of this country, of this people, what, if anything, can the state do immediately?
Well, the South African government and the state finds itself in a very unique position. First of all, if you go to section 231, 232, 234 to 5, it speaks about the application of international law, that it abides by international law. Now here comes your problem. We must understand that the Constitution itself is a product of a consensus called CODESA. And this CODESA didn't incorporate everybody else. On the one hand, you only had white people that went to a referendum. The rest of us, I don't recall any ANC or PAC, whoever was part there, coming to get my mandate or anybody else's mandate. They went there and they stuck to certain protocol processes that they wanted to introduce. Now, for me, the argument is very simple. We have now started to establish ourselves as the Kwekam people. On the 1st of December 2023, we launched the Arrow Circle of Elders Council, which is called the El Kebolan Restorative Reservoir of Wisdom, Arrow for short, Circle of Elders Council. And within that process, we recognized that you had two classes of people. The same like in the 1905 census.
Yeah.
They only registered white stroke European. Whether you were Portuguese or Italian or whatever, it was white stroke European. Okay. On the other hand, in 1905 at the census, they had colored stroke native. So do you see they only had two types of categories?
Okay.
So for me, the argument really is we want to take this nation with earnest roots. We've met before. We've been part of the Land Summit in 2018 when he was still part of the AfriForum. And we've made it very clear. We have inalienable rights that must be processed. Unless the South African government did not send a sitting president to sign UNDRIP in 2007, then we're sitting with a problem.
Yeah. Adams, same question to you.
Well, if the question is what ought to be done, I think it should start with respect and recognition for cultural diversity. I think we should move away from this notion that to be a South African implies that you should not have some cultural identity that is unique and that you wish to preserve, because it's very natural and normal for people to wish to cherish their cultural identities, their languages, their religion, and so forth. And so if we want to move forward, the way forward would be to have some form of recognition for this diversity.
Okay.
And diversity is supposed to be a healthy thing, but it has become a very destructive thing because there's not a proper recognition for what it is supposed to mean.
Deputy Minister, we have 30 seconds left. Do we give sufficient recognition to minorities and the diversity that exists in South Africa?
Well, I would say President Mbeki's foundation has been requested, among other institutions, to lead a process that will culminate into a national dialogue. So everybody, every institution, every sector will be invited, because we think that it's important to review the 30 years and see how do we define further the process of moving towards building a non-racial, non-sexist and prosperous country, which we all feel proud of being associated with and being identified as South Africans.
Unfortunately, that's where we're going to have it. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I really do appreciate it. It's a heated conversation. We continue in this month to focus on minority issues across the span of our history. We'll focus as well on linguistic rights in South Africa on the next installment of Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for being with us. If you missed this episode, catch it on YouTube. It is SABC News on our YouTube channel. Good night for now. Cheers.